So hey there, this is Tyler from the Horrible Podcast, and I'm doing something a little bit different. The rest of the guys aren't here. I'm just going to talk about something I read. I did a brief audio post a while back over a book I read called Jaws, and I had a lot of fun talking about it just sitting down by myself. And I thought that I'd stream a little bit and maybe talk about the another book that I read. And every time I finish a horror novel, I thought I'd do something like this, do a little streaming video just to talk about what I thought about it, the influences, why I read it, and just generally talk about books, which we really don't get a chance to do on the podcast. So, fair warning, there might be the sounds of scurrying animals around, and there's a dog on the couch just behind me, so if she starts whining, I might have to let her out. But otherwise, I'm just going to sit and talk for a little while about a book that I read. So be aware that there will be environmental noise. It's also raining ever so gently outside, so there might be some environmental noise or some dog or cat. You might hear the pattering of a cat's feet behind me, so be aware of that. But otherwise, I'm just going to talk about John W. Campbell's Who Goes There. I don't have the book in front of me because I listened to it on Audible. So technically, I didn't read the book. I listened to it, but let's not get into semantics, shall we? That's an argument for a different time. But it's kind of a snack of a novel. It's a novella or novelette, or it's a short novel. It's kind of like a long short story. Stephen King's The Mist level length, so not very long at all. But I listened to the entire thing in almost one, just sort of like a trip to the grocery store and coming back and cleaning up the house listen, and I was kind of blown away by it. A lot of people, I looked at some reviews on Goodreads, which whatever, like I don't pay attention to those very much, but it seemed like a lot of people didn't like it as much. And I have to say that I'm kind of astounded by that. It was a really tightly written, sort of interesting novel, and it has so much to offer science fiction as a whole, and so many novels and movies owe this particular work a debt of gratitude. Anyway, okay, I'm going to get into the history of it first. John W. Campbell was, I think, he held a lot of jobs before he became a writer, but he published Who Goes There in the 1930s, I think, and it was a sensation, and people loved it. And it was originally produced by Howard Hawks as The Thing from Another World in 1951, I believe. This is all, I didn't do any research, but I think it was 1951 that The Thing from Another World came out. And based on the foreword to the novel, the introduction, it was both met with sort of like critical ambivalence and sort of audience ambivalence. There were people who loved it. I mean, I think it did well, but there were also people who really didn't like it. So people who were purists of the novel. It almost sounded like the internet when the guy who wrote Logan's Run, William F. Nolan, maybe, the way that he described the reaction was very much like the internet saying that's not close enough to the book. But that's been happening since novels have been translated to the big screen. So it didn't do particularly well. It became sort of a Frankenstein tale, which is vastly, vastly different from the original actual story, which is much more quiet and about fear and paranoia. And this even predates the Red Scare of the 1950s. It was written, I guess, in the wake of World War I, just before World War II. So it doesn't have any like overt political tones that I know of. However, it still is a great analog for that sort of thing, and you could talk about it in those terms. It's weird that something that was written at the time like could hold up for this long. Science fiction, especially something written so long ago, could still be relevant today. I guess it was because of some of the science stuff is kind of whatever. I guess that's a great criticism. The science is kind of whatever, but it is dated. But the story itself is still really awesome. So what happens in Who Goes There, which was it is most closely related to the John Carpenter The Thing version that was released in 1982 that bombed against E.T. What is about is a set of scientists living in Antarctica doing science stuff. They're, checking environmental things and like they're doing work as scientists. They happen upon a thing from another world. And like the interesting thing, the novel thing is how, I guess I can't say thing a lot in this, can I? Because I'm going to have to eventually. What is novel about this? Damn it. What is new and interesting about this is that it approaches the, hey, there's an alien aspect from a completely different angle. And that's what really sets it apart. It's not just, hey, there's an alien and it's going to take over. It's about the characters in the novel. And if you're a fan of the John Carpenter version, the John Carpenter version is as true to the novel as I think it could have been given the circumstances. There are some things that are taken out, but it's still a really interesting sort of like exploration of these themes about paranoia. And I love it. Like, this book is about paranoia. It's not about science or aliens or science fiction even. It's about paranoia. And that's what's really awesome about Who Goes There. So they discover an alien and learn that, first of all, it's dead, and they think it's dead. It's frozen in the ice, as the John Carpenter version sort of makes use of. And in John Carpenter's version, it's not the Americans who discover it, but the Swedes. I mean Norwegians, Mac. It's not the Americans who discover it in the movie. It's Norwegians, and the Americans happen upon it. They go to the other camp, and that's where they find it. That sort of thing. In here, it's in Who Goes There is the Americans who find this frozen corpse of an alien, and they're immediately divided on it. Blair, who is played by Wilford Brimley in the John Carpenter version, is his character in the novel is really interesting because he is at first the advocate for sort of following this thing up and like seeing where sort of dissecting it will go. But no one else is really on his side. So there's a lot of talk about science. Like, there's a lot of science here. And I think that John W. Campbell had a degree in some sort of science. So there's a lot of discussion about science here, and they come to the conclusion that they're going to let it thaw out, which is played really well because it's paced really well. And it doesn't linger. As soon as the novel goes away from this idea, it comes back to it almost immediately because the monster alien escapes. And there will be spoilers throughout this. I guess it shouldn't have taken me 8 minutes to be able to get to the idea that there will be spoilers. But yeah, I'm going to talk about the book in its entirety. So it's not that much. So if you haven't read it, go away and come back and it'll be fine. But the monster escapes. It thaws out, and they describe the sound of the author, John W. Campbell, describes I don't know why they, describes the sound of dripping ice, and it's really off-putting. But I really like how that works within the context of what's going on. And most of the characters from the movie are in the novel. When I say the movie, I'm referring almost exclusively to the John Carpenter version. It's not some sort of I think William F. Nolan called the Howard Hawks version a science fiction melodrama, or not noir melodrama, but genre melodrama or something like that. This is not like that. It's very really well crafted, and after the monster escapes, the camp sort of breaks into two factions. In fact, I think there are 37 people in the camp in the book as opposed to the 12 or 13 who are in the movie. And all your favorites are there. I mean, there is MacReady, except what's weird about MacReady is how he's described in the book. I think he's very obviously described as the protagonist. I mean, in the movie, the character of MacReady is much more like unwilling and uncertain about the idea of being the hero, and I think that plays to its benefit. John W. Campbell had no interest in sort of graying out the areas of who is the hero here. MacReady is very obviously the hero. When he's described as like a bronze god, and he's described as bronze a lot. So I don't know why. I do think John W. Campbell is a really talented writer, very obviously talented. His descriptions are amazing, but his use of adjectives and later adverbs was kind of off-putting. I mean, this is, I guess, like the way that pulp writers describe things. They use a lot of adverbs. Things had a lot of LYs before them. And so that's kind of weird. Like the description of MacReady especially is very bizarre, given the fact that in the movie he's not. He's just sort of like a wounded Vietnam vet kind of person, as I think several of the other characters are as well. Like I think Bennings maybe is the guy who's on Law and Order. He was the sort of like pot smoking other helicopter pilot, and in the book when everyone, like MacReady doesn't immediately step in. There's a lot of discussion, but MacReady is clearly the person who was like the 12 Angry Men, like the jury chief person, who's in the middle, who is very clear headed, as opposed to people who are discussing these like frantic terms before they move on to a decision. MacReady is clearly the guy who steps in, and they get into a lot of, I don't remember the exact lineage of how they get to the idea that it can imitate other things. I think it's when it escapes and they find it when it's fighting, they're fighting it and it's fighting the dogs, which is very reminiscent of the scene from the movie where it has clearly become one of the dogs, or a dog is an alien and it hatches and becomes the giant thing. This is me making the giant alien dog hands. When it becomes the giant thing that splits open like a flower, it's like a flower of tongues from the movie. It's very clearly a reference to that. Sorry, not a reference to that, but the movie definitely uses that scene, and a lot of what happens is very clearly from the book and taken from the book and not changed to make it more modern or whatever. There are even lines of dialogue that are exactly the same. Like later, at one point, MacReady in the book says, when they're doing the blood test, he says, "I'm going to prove to you what I already know," which is a line that MacReady says in the movie. But they fight it with the dogs. They even use a blowtorch, a giant blowtorch to quote unquote kill it. And that's when everything intensifies, because that's when Blair, Wilford Brimley, loses his mind, and they have. What I love is the dialogue. I don't think everyone gets an equal number of lines. It's more sort of even-handed in the movie, but the book gives the characters some amount of characterization. And what's weird though is that characters are described like animals. I think Blair is described as very bird-like, so it casts him as a villainous character from the very beginning. Like he moves his head in a bird-like fashion, and birds play into a discussion of what's going on later on when they start to think like, how can this shape-shifting mimic get off of Antarctica and infect the rest of the planet? And birds are brought up, especially the what's the bird that's in? I can't remember. But I'll have to come back to it. Damn it. I can't think of the kind of bird I'm thinking of. Albatross. I was thinking albatross around the neck. That's what I was doing. There's not a bird with a giant beard, not a wispy Disney character. And the birds play a very heavy role in it. And Blair is described as a bird, which is, it's kind of neat, but also kind of like ham-fisted in another way as well. And so once they kind of figure out what they're going to do with the book, I don't know what I'm thinking. When they figure out what they're going to do with the alien, Well, they don't. They kind of want to ship it back. They kind of are going to hang on to it. The cook here he's in the audiobook, he's portrayed as like a New Yorker, almost like, hey, you're going to cook for yourself if you leave the alien in there, which is not, that's not New York. I can't do accents. I'm sorry if that was offensive to anyone who has ears or eyes. You saw me do it. If you're watching the video right now, which if you're watching the video right now, you're watching it. But the book then proceeds pretty much like the movie. I mean, they become pretty interested in the serum or the blood test fairly early on in the book, and for some reason that hangs heavily over the rest of it for me. Like, it takes a long time because at first it doesn't work. They have to hang on to the blood, and they find out that the blood, the dogs are, I don't remember how to say it. It's like they use an analogy of how rabbits become human, not indifferent, but they don't get infected by, I don't know. So same thing. That's the same concept. So they end up killing all of the dogs. Every single one of the dogs gets killed, and all of the cattle get killed because they bring up this idea that the way to kill basically mad cow disease is to make sure that no one has it, which is to say kill everything and everyone who is infected. And that starts to sort of infiltrate everyone's minds in the book. They start to think of ways of like sort of getting away from that idea of, hey, we're going to kill everyone who shows any signs of infection has to die, because first of all, they don't know who is infected. They can't tell. That's why they bring up the blood serum test, which later takes on a much more political bent, unknowingly, of course, in the John Carpenter version, because if you listen to the audio commentary of the movie, Kurt Russell and John Carpenter talked at length about this idea that they had made this movie about not knowing who's infected and interacting with people who might be infected with something but you don't know, and then this idea of like a blood test to be able to tell you if you're infected without knowing, like everyone looks normal, and how a lot of people accuse Carpenter of making this movie about AIDS later, but they didn't really know what it was. I mean, Carpenter, Kurt Russell, and the rest, like, they had not heard of it. So but it did become like a weird, timely discussion of this thing of AIDS at this time. But it had nothing to do with that in the 1930s, but it is used to great effect later. And in the book, Gary, I can't remember who plays the actor's name in the movie, but he's a very well-known actor. He kind of looks like Lloyd Bridges, if that makes any sense. He's in Terms of Endearment. I think he dies in Terms of Endearment, if you remember that. I think, but he kind of looks like Lloyd Bridges, and he's like the commissioner, the chief. He's the one who has the gun in the movie and shoots the Norwegian at the very beginning of the movie when they're saying the dog is infected, the dog is an alien in Norwegian. So he's infected, and other people are infected, and they end up taking care of them. A lot of the violence takes place off screen, which is totally different from John Carpenter. Like, that's one of the biggest criticisms leveled at John Carpenter's the thing is that the tension takes a backseat to the sort of like rubbery, gross monsters that are on screen. That's kind of the thing I love about that movie today, but it's what people loathed about that movie at the time. Like, they said that all of that, sort of all those shenanigans sort of robbed the movie of its tension, which I kind of disagree. I think it's amazing. The Thing is one of my favorite movies of all time. I remember watching it as a kid and not appreciating it. First of all, I thought it was really gross. And I wasn't into science fiction as a kid. I was more into horror. So I wanted a horror movie, and I didn't realize The Thing was a horror movie. I thought it was more of a science fiction movie, not a horror movie. So I was like, this isn't for me. But I remember in college, it was on USA in the middle of the day. I have no idea how I got to watch it. I was just like flipping through the TV somehow, and it came on. And I watched the entire thing, and I was wrapped, just completely wrapped by that movie, and bought the DVD and just watched it 100 times. And this was just before, not too long before the PS2 game came out. If anyone remembers that, the PS2 Xbox version of the game, which takes place directly after the movie, in the wake of the movie, sort of like it takes place with the crew that comes in to save everyone. But anyway, it blew my mind. I mean, I'm still sort of obsessed with that movie to this day. It's amazing, and I'm working on a novel that is my version of The Thing / a couple of other things. Like it's an amalgamation of things that make me happy, and it's science fiction, but also horror. And I mean, the scene with it's not Willis. Willis is not the name of the guy whose head detaches, and the doctor whose hands go in and come out stubs. That's still one of the most horrifying and terrifyingly gross scenes in any movie I've ever seen. It just looks disgusting. The practical effects, Rob Bottin, I think, did the effects for it and did such a crazily fantastic job with the effects, the practical effects. They're like one of my favorite effects movies of all time. So if you haven't seen John Carpenter's The Thing, what are you doing? If you're watching this, you've definitely seen it, so I'm sorry. I don't mean to insult you. But if you happen upon this because I'm good looking, or you think that the picture, the other side, right there, is weird looking, then hey, welcome. This is The Horrible Podcast. I am Tyler of The Horrible Podcast. But otherwise, yeah, you've seen the movie and know that the effects in the thing are crazy good. Just crazy good effects. Where was I? So yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter. I don't have to go point by point, blow by blow, but what's cool about the book is that it has a happy ending, but the movie's ending is way better. Like they just managed to avoid like societal collapse in the book because, I mean, they stop it before it happens. Not that they like go in and save everyone after they're infected, but when they go back to check on Blair, Blair has become one of those things. Like, to no one's surprise, today. And they manage to kill him, and they find an anti-gravity device that was going to be used to somehow they are able to infer that is going to be able to jump from Antarctica to the United States. I have no idea. And that's that. They kill Blair. They find this spaceship, and it kind of ends on this sort of like weird note. Like, it still ends on a weird note. It doesn't end with like everything is happy. It just ends with we managed to stop this thing, which is neat because the movie takes it a step further where we have two characters and we don't know if one of them is infected or not. I mean, the video game changes our thoughts there, but in the movie, we have no idea. And I think that's what's brilliant about John Carpenter's movie is that we have no idea who's infected even still. Even survivors may be infected. It's just really cool. I mean, both the movie and the book are great. I'm a huge fan. So it's... I can't think of a science fiction movie, a horror science fiction movie I like more, except for maybe Alien. But even then, I've seen The Thing 2 times as many times as I've seen the Alien. I mean, it's just not even close. So the book is well written, but it's also kind of hacky in some weird ways. Like, the use of adverbs is overdone. Everything like suddenly and suspiciously, and like people do things with LYs attached to them a lot, and that's not part of our modern day sensibilities. Although it would be interesting if someone wrote a novel today that was like a faux pulp novel that's done like that, like a science fiction novel that purposefully uses adverbs as a way of like re-hearkening back to that. I don't know. Anyway, it's great. It was on sale on Audible for like $2, and I got 4 hours of entertainment out of it, or whatever, 2.5 hours of entertainment, however long it is. It's fantastic book. And it only take you a couple of hours to read, so I'd definitely say check out John W. Campbell's Who Goes There, especially if you're a fan of John Carpenter or the Howard Hawks version of Thing from Another World. So At this point, I will bid adieu. This has been Illiterated, Volume 2, John W. Campbell's Who Goes There. Thanks. We'll see you next time. This is Tyler from The Horrible Podcast. Bye. Wait, that's an argument for a different time. But it's kind of a snack of a novel. It's a novella or novelette, or it's a short novel. It's kind of like a long short story. Stephen King's The Mist level length, so not very long at all. But I listened to the entire thing in almost one, just sort of like a trip to the grocery store and coming back and cleaning up the house listen, and I was kind of blown away by it. A lot of people, I looked at some reviews on Goodreads, which whatever, like I don't pay attention to those very much, but it seemed like a lot of people didn't like it as much. And I have to say that I'm kind of astounded by that. It was a really tightly written, sort of interesting novel, and it has so much to offer science fiction as a whole, and so many novel scurrying animals around, and there's a dog on the couch just behind me, so if she starts whining, I might have to let her out. But otherwise, I'm just going to sit and talk for a little while about a book that I read. So be aware that there will be environmental noise. It's also raining ever so gently outside, so there might be some environmental noise or some dog or cat. You might hear the pattering of a cat's feet behind me, so be aware of that. But otherwise, I'm just going to talk about John W. Campbell's Who Goes There. I don't have the book in front of me because I listened to it on Audible. So technically, I didn't read the book. I listened to it, but let's not get into semantics, shall we? So, hey there, this is Tyler from The Horrible Podcast, and I'm doing something a little bit different. The rest of the guys aren't here. I'm just going to talk about something I read. I did a brief audio post a while back over a book I read called Jaws, and I had a lot of fun talking about it just sitting down by myself, and I thought that I'd stream a little bit and maybe talk about the another book that I read, and every time I finish a horror novel, I thought I'd do something like this, do a little streaming video just to talk about what I thought about it, the influences, why I read it, and just generally talk about books, which we really don't get a chance to do on the podcast. So, fair warning, there might be the sounds of ambivalence. There were people who loved it. I mean, I think it did well, but there were also people who really didn't like it. So people who were purists of the novel. It almost sounded like the internet when the guy who wrote Logan's Run, William F. Nolan, maybe, the way that he described the reaction was very much like the internet saying, that's not close enough to the book, but that's been happening since novels have been translated to the big screen. So it didn't do particularly well. It became sort of a Frankenstein tale, which is vastly, vastly different from the original actual story, which is much more quiet and about fear and paranoia. And this even predates the Red Scare of the 1950s. It was written, I guess, in movies owe this particular work a debt of gratitude. Anyway, okay, I'm going to get into the history of it first. John W. Campbell was, I think, he held a lot of jobs before he became a writer, but he published Who Goes There in the 1930s, I think, and it was a sensation, and people loved it. And it was originally produced by Howard Hawks as The Thing from Another World in 1951, I believe. This is all, I didn't do any research, but I think it was 1951 that The Thing from Another World came out. And based on the foreword to the novel, the introduction, it was both met with sort of like critical ambivalence and sort of audience